Hey everyone, and welcome to a deep dive that might hit a little close to home for some of us.
Yeah, who knew?
People pleasing.
That's a big one.
Yeah, we're going to explore this tendency, and more importantly, how setting boundaries can help us break free.
Yeah, break free from that.
We'll be drawing insights from a Bible study led by Leadon from Unchained Disciples.
Michael Leadon.
Um,
And this is good stuff.
it's fascinating how he connects this seemingly modern issue to a biblical figure,
Yeah.
King Saul.
King Saul, who would have thought?
Who would have thought that the Apostle Paul, known for his boldness and unwavering faith, could have anything in common with those of us who
Yeah.
struggle with people-pleasing?
It seems like they're total opposites, right?
It does seem like an odd pairing.
Yeah.
So let's start with the basics.
Okay.
What exactly does Michael define as people-pleasing?
Yeah, so Michael defines a people pleaser as someone who feels this intense urge to please others.
Okay.
Even if it means sacrificing their own needs and well-being, they consistently prioritize what others want above their own,
Right.
often driven by fear of rejection or conflict.
So it's not just about being kind and helpful.
No,
It goes deeper than that.
exactly.
Okay.
You hit the nail on the head.
So,
It's about the motivation behind our actions.
yeah.
While kindness stems from a genuine desire to care for others.
Right.
People-pleasing is often rooted in fear and insecurity.
Okay.
It's about seeking external validation to
Mhm.
feel worthy.
Okay, I'm starting to see the distinction.
Yeah.
But how does King Saul fit into all of this?
Well, Michael uses Saul's story as a powerful example of how people-pleasing, even with seemingly good intentions, can have disastrous consequences.
Okay, remind me about Saul's story. It's been a while since Sunday school.
All right, so Saul was the first king of Israel,
Yeah.
chosen by God to lead his people.
Mm-hmm.
In 1 Samuel 15,
Okay.
God commands Saul to completely destroy the Amalekites, their livestock, and all their possessions.
Wow.
Everything.
That's intense.
But Saul, wanting to appease the people,
Okay.
spares the Amalekite king and keeps the best of the livestock.
So he directly disobeyed God's command
Yes.
because he was more concerned with what the people would think.
Precisely.
Wow.
And this wasn't just a minor slip-up.
Right.
Saul's actions had far-reaching consequences.
Mm.
Because of his disobedience, God ultimately rejected him as king.
Oh, wow.
Michael uses this story to illustrate how putting the approval of others before obedience to God can lead us down a dangerous path.
That's a sobering thought. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you knew what you should do? Maybe even felt God nudging you in a certain direction, but the fear of disappointing others held you back?
Oh, absolutely.
I know I have.
Yeah, that internal struggle is something many of us can relate to. The
Yeah.
pressure to conform to avoid conflict or
Yeah.
to maintain a certain image can be incredibly strong.
Mm.
But Michael reminds us that true freedom comes from seeking God's approval above all else. That makes sense. But how does that play out in everyday life? Like, are we supposed to become hermits and cut ourselves off from everyone to avoid people-pleasing?
Not at all.
Okay.
Michael isn't advocating for isolation.
Right.
He's talking about a shift in perspective,
Okay.
a reordering of our priorities.
Mm-hmm.
He points to Colossians 3:1-3,
Okay.
which says, "Since then, you have been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God."
So it's about aligning our hearts and minds with God's will
Yes.
instead of being consumed with what others think of us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that our true identity, our worth,
Yeah.
is found in Christ, not in the fleeting opinions of others.
Okay, I'm starting to see how revolutionary this concept is. But to be honest, it also feels a little daunting.
Yeah.
How do we practically shift our focus from people-pleasing to seeking God's approval?
That's where the concept of boundaries comes in.
That's a great question.
Boundaries. So how do boundaries tie into all of this?
Think of it this way. If people-pleasing is about constantly giving ourselves a way to gain approval,
Mm-hmm.
setting boundaries is about reclaiming ourselves, our time, and our energy.
Okay.
So we can live in alignment with our values and God's purpose for our lives.
I see the connection.
Yeah.
But how could we tell if we're truly acting out of love or if we're slipping back into people-pleasing mode?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not always easy to decipher those motivations.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
Michael acknowledges that it's a process, a journey of self-discovery and awareness.
Mm-hmm.
He encourages us to examine our hearts
Okay.
and ask ourselves some tough questions.
Like, are we saying yes because we genuinely want to help? Or are we driven by guilt obligation or a fear of what others might think?
Precisely. And sometimes it can be a mixture of both.
Right.
But the key is to become aware of those underlying motivations
Right.
and to discern what's truly honoring to God and to ourselves.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is already making me rethink some of my own patterns. But what if we've been people-pleasing for so long that it's become second nature?
Ah.
How do we break free from those deeply ingrained habits?
That's where Michael gets really practical.
Okay.
He offers some tangible steps we can take to start setting boundaries and reclaiming our lives.
Okay. I'm all ears. Give me those practical steps.
Well, Michael says that one of the first steps is to identify how you seek approval.
Okay.
What actions do you take to try to impress others?
Okay.
Do you constantly offer to do things you secretly hope people will decline?
Oh, they do that all the time.
Right.
Or maybe finding yourself agreeing with everyone even when you totally disagree.
Yes.
I've definitely been there.
Those are classic signs.
Yeah.
Once you start recognizing those patterns, you can begin to challenge them.
Okay.
Michael also suggests revealing yourself to safe people.
So vulnerability plays a role in this too.
Absolutely. It's about letting people see the real you, not the carefully curated version you think they want to see.
Right.
And Michael also emphasizes the importance of getting comfortable with not offering.
Okay.
He reminds us of 2 Corinthians 9:7,
Okay.
which says, "Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver."
So if you're only offering to do something because you feel obligated,
Yes,
or you're worried about what people will think,
exactly.
maybe it's time to reevaluate.
That's a great takeaway.
Yeah.
Michael also talks about the power of setting time limits and blocking out your calendar, protect your time and energy.
It's like creating those much-needed boundaries we were talking about earlier.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Speaking of boundaries, Michael defines boundaries as guidelines, rules, or limits that define what you're okay with and what you're not.
They're like personal fences.
Yes.
They provide protection while still allowing for connection and vulnerability.
That's a great analogy. Boundaries aren't about building walls to shut people out.
Right.
They're about creating healthy and sustainable relationships.
This has been so insightful. It's amazing how much we can learn from the Bible about navigating modern-day challenges like people-pleasing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we've only just scratched the surface.
I'm ready to dive even deeper into this whole boundary thing. What are some practical examples of boundaries we can set in everyday life, and how do we actually go about communicating them effectively?
Those are great questions, and we'll explore them in more detail in part 2 of this deep dive.
I can't wait.
Stay tuned. Yeah, it's so freeing to realize we don't have to be everything to everyone.
You're right. It is. Okay, so we've established that boundaries are essential for breaking free from people-pleasing. But setting those boundaries can feel, well, kind of selfish. Aren't we as Christians called to put others first?
That's a common misconception that Michael tackles head on. He says that confusing boundaries with selfishness is a trap. Boundaries aren't about neglecting others or refusing to lend a hand. They're about making sure you're taking care of your own well-being so that you can show up for others in a healthy and sustainable way.
It's like that saying, you can't pour from an empty cup.
Exactly. Imagine you're constantly running on empty, overcommitted, and feeling resentful. How effective can you really be in loving and serving others? Setting boundaries is an act of self-care. It allows you to love and serve others from a place of wholeness and authenticity.
That's a great point. So how do we go about actually setting those boundaries? Where do we even start?
Michael emphasizes the importance of being clear, direct, and kind when communicating our boundaries.
So no more beating around the bush or hoping people will just magically figure out what we need.
Exactly. It's about being assertive but respectful. Remember, it's not about controlling the other person's behavior. You can't force someone to change. It's about taking responsibility for your own actions and responses.
Okay, so it's like drawing a line in the sand for yourself, saying this is what I'm okay with and this is what I'm not okay with.
Precisely. And being consistent with those boundaries, even when it feels uncomfortable, is crucial.
But what if someone keeps pushing those boundaries even after you've clearly communicated them?
That's where consequences come in. And Michael is very clear about establishing those consequences up front, not in the heat of the moment when emotions are running high.
So you're not making decisions based on anger or frustration, but from a place of thoughtful consideration.
Right. Think about it prayerfully. What are the natural consequences if this boundary is crossed?
What kind of consequences are we talking about?
It varies depending on the situation. Sometimes it might be ending a conversation. Other times it might be limiting contact with that person, or in extreme cases, even ending the relationship if the boundary is repeatedly violated.
So it's a graduated approach.
Yes, and what's crucial is that you follow through on the consequence. If you don't, you're sending mixed messages and undermining your own boundaries. Consistency is key to building trust, both with yourself and the other person.
This is giving me a lot to think about. What about those times when we need to create emotional distance to protect ourselves, especially in a difficult or toxic relationship?
Michael says emotional distance is sometimes necessary, especially when dealing with abuse.
So it's like taking a step back to create some space for yourself.
Exactly. And Michael emphasizes that emotional distance should be temporary. It's not a permanent solution, but rather a way to create a safe space for healing and reassessment. He also cautions against returning to an abusive relationship until it's demonstrably safe and real change has occurred.
It sounds like setting boundaries is an ongoing process, not a one-time fix.
You got it. And Michael encourages us to be patient with ourselves. Don't try to change everything overnight. Start with one small boundary and practice being consistent.
Okay, so baby steps.
Hmm.
What are some concrete examples of those small boundaries we can start implementing? I know Michael dives into some real-life scenarios in his teachings.
He does. For instance, let's say someone is a hugger and you're not comfortable with close physical contact. Michael suggests setting a physical boundary right from the start. You could say something like, "Hey, I'm more of a handshake person. Nice to see you."
That's a great example. Simple, direct, and avoids any awkwardness. What about those friends or family members who are constantly negative? I always feel obligated to listen and offer advice, but it ends up draining my energy.
Michael suggests setting a time limit for venting sessions. You could say something like, "I'm happy to listen for 15 minutes, but then I need to get going. I have a lot on my plate today." Setting those time boundaries protects your energy and emotional well-being.
Those are practical tips. Sometimes I just crave some solitude, but I feel guilty saying no to social gatherings.
It's okay to prioritize your need for solitude. Michael encourages us to be upfront about that. You could simply say, "I'm going to take some time for myself today to recharge. I'll catch up with you later this week." It's all about communicating your needs honestly and respectfully.
This is making me realize how much I've been neglecting my own needs in an attempt to keep everyone else happy. What about those situations where people just constantly interrupt or talk over you?
Communication boundaries are crucial too. Michael suggests being assertive but kind. You could say, "I know you're excited to share your thoughts, but would you mind letting me finish my point first?"
These are all such helpful examples. I remember we talked about the hook, line, and sinker technique for shutting down inappropriate conversations. What exactly is that?
Yes. Michael uses this lighthearted term to describe a way to gracefully redirect a conversation away from an offensive or inappropriate topic. It involves acknowledging the question or comment, setting a firm boundary, and then swiftly changing the subject.
Could you give an example? I'm having a hard time picturing how that works.
Sure, imagine someone is pressing you for personal information you don't feel comfortable sharing. You could say, "That's a very personal question, and I'm not quite ready to share that yet. But hey, did you see that new documentary everyone's talking about? It's about setting a boundary without being confrontational."
That's brilliant. It diffuses the tension while still maintaining your boundaries.
Exactly. And Michael reminds us that we don't have to play the mind-reading game either. It's okay to set boundaries around unspoken expectations.
You mean those times when you feel pressured to know what someone else is thinking without them actually saying it?
Yes. Or when they expect you to be a mind reader. Michael encourages open and honest communication instead of relying on assumptions.
So if you're feeling upset, express it clearly. If you have a need, articulate it. And don't expect your partner or friends to just automatically know what's going on in your head.
Absolutely. Clear communication is so much more effective than mind reading.
This is eye-opening. I'm starting to see how boundaries are about so much more than just saying no. They're about creating healthy, respectful relationships where everyone feels seen and heard.
That's a great way to put it. And remember, it's okay to disagree with others.
You mean we don't have to be carbon copies of each other to have a good relationship?
Exactly. Expecting someone to agree with you all the time is unrealistic and unhealthy. Embrace those differences. Those contrasting viewpoints can actually lead to some of the most enriching conversations and growth opportunities.
This deep dive is making me rethink a lot of my past interactions. I'm wondering, what are some of the challenges we might encounter as we start implementing these boundaries? Because I have a feeling it won't always be smooth sailing.
You're right. Setting boundaries can bring up resistance,
Yeah.
especially from people who are used to you always saying yes. We'll explore those potential challenges and how to navigate them in part 3 of this deep dive.
So much to think about. Where do we even begin? I mean, are we just supposed to flip a switch and suddenly become boundary-setting masters?
That would be nice, wouldn't it?
Right. But I have a feeling it's not that simple.
You're right. It's not always easy. In fact, Michael warns us that setting boundaries can actually stir up some unexpected challenges.
Oh, like what?
Well, think about it. If you've been a people pleaser for a long time, those around you have probably gotten pretty comfortable with that version of you.
So when we start setting those boundaries, it's like shaking things up, disrupting the status quo.
Exactly. And not everyone's going to be thrilled about that.
That makes sense, but how do we prepare for that potential pushback?
Michael emphasizes the importance of setting boundaries with both firmness and grace.
So it's not about becoming a rigid, unyielding wall.
Nope, not at all. It's about communicating our needs with clarity and respect, while also acknowledging that others might have different perspectives and, might not always agree.
So it's about finding that balance between standing our ground and being compassionate.
Exactly.
Okay, but what if we encounter resistance from people who are used to us always bending over backward to accommodate them?
That's where consistency is key.
So we can't give in to guilt trips or manipulations.
Nope, we got to stand firm.
Oh, those dreaded guilt trips. I'm already getting anxious just thinking about them.
I hear you. They can be tough.
So how do we say no without feeling like we're being mean or selfish, especially with those close to us?
That's where checking our motivations comes in. Are we saying no because we truly can't meet their request? Or are we saying no because we're afraid of what others will think?
So it's all about being genuine in our responses.
Yeah.
If our heart's in the right place, then our no will be received with more understanding.
Right. If it's a true no, it's a true no.
I see that. Okay, but what if setting those boundaries leads to conflict? I'm not always the best at handling those situations.
I get it. Conflict can be uncomfortable, for sure. But Michael encourages us to reframe conflict as a potential opportunity for growth and deeper understanding.
Okay, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, and remember, setting boundaries isn't about winning an argument or trying to control the other person. It's about honoring yourself and working towards creating a healthier dynamic in that relationship.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, this is also helpful, but I have a confession to make. Sometimes I struggle to distinguish between showing genuine love and simply trying to please everyone. How can we become more aware of those motivations and decipher them?
That's something a lot of us wrestle with, right? Michael suggests taking a moment to pause and examine our hearts, asking ourselves, why am I doing this? Am I driven by a genuine desire to help, or is there an underlying fear of disapproval or rejection lurking beneath the surface?
That's such a simple yet powerful question.
Right, and sometimes it can be a mix of both. Maybe you do genuinely want to help, but there's also a part of you that's worried about the consequences of saying no.
So it's about being honest with ourselves about those mixed motivations. That can be tough.
It can, and sometimes it's helpful to get an outside perspective from someone we trust, like a friend, a mentor, or maybe even a therapist.
So bouncing our thoughts and feelings off someone we trust can provide some valuable insight.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's say we've identified some people-pleasing patterns and we're ready to start setting boundaries, but we're feeling kind of stuck. What's a good first step? I remember Michael mentioning something called covert contracts. What exactly are those?
Ah, yes, covert contracts. These are those unspoken agreements we often make without even realizing it.
Oh, so it's like when you do something for someone with the expectation that they'll reciprocate in some way, but you never actually talk about it.
Exactly, you're picking up what I'm putting down.
Like when you always offer to pick up the tab for dinner, secretly hoping your friends will eventually return the favor.
Perfect example. Or maybe you constantly go above and beyond for a coworker, expecting them to recognize your efforts and maybe put in a good word for you with the boss.
It's all about those unspoken expectations. And what happens when those expectations aren't met? Resentment.
You got it. Resentment city. And that can lead to some strained relationships because, well, we never actually communicated those needs directly.
So Michael encourages us to bring those covert contracts to the surface, both the ones we have with others and the ones others might have with us. But how do we actually address those covert contracts? Do we just blurt out, hey, I've been doing all this stuff for you, and now I expect you to do the same for me?
Maybe not that directly. It's more about becoming aware of those expectations and then shifting those dynamics by communicating our needs more clearly.
So instead of always being the first one to offer, maybe we wait and see if others step up.
Exactly. And if you're constantly feeling resentful or taken advantage of, it's a good sign that it's time to have an honest conversation about those unspoken expectations.
This has been such a mind-blowing conversation, really. It's making me realize how much I've been on autopilot in my relationships, just going with the flow instead of being intentional. I'm actually feeling excited to start setting those healthy boundaries. But I'm sure it's going to be a process.
Oh, it absolutely is. But Michael reminds us that it's a journey, not a destination. There will be bumps along the way, for sure. But the freedom and peace that come from living authentically and honoring our needs, totally worth it.
You're right. It's been such an empowering deep dive into the world of people-pleasing and boundaries. I feel like I'm walking away with a whole new perspective on how to approach my relationships in a healthier, more fulfilling way.
That's fantastic to hear. And remember, you are worthy of love and respect just as you are. You don't have to earn it by constantly bending over backwards to please others.
That's a powerful reminder. So as we wrap up this deep dive, listeners, remember this. You have the power to create healthier, more fulfilling relationships by setting those boundaries. It might feel daunting at first, but the freedom and peace you gain will be worth the effort.
Yeah, take those small steps, be patient with yourself, and celebrate those wins along the way. You got this.